Over the last 24 hours, we've had a series of protests across the country post the Prime Minister's announcement of an extended lockdown that now goes on till the 3rd of May. To take you through the kind of protests we've seen, outside of Bandra, of course, there was a very publicized gathering of at least 1,000 people, of daily wage laborers from UP, Bihar, West Bengal, who had assembled, outside of Bandra station, demanding that they be allowed to go home. Now, the police tells us that this actually happened because there was a rumor that the trains would begin again and they would be allowed to go. There's also, from what we understand, one arrest that has been made in regard to fake news that one of the journalists put out, saying the trains will be allowed to move, outside of Bandra station. Other than this, in Mumbai, outside of Mumbai, laborers wanted to walk home and they had to be convinced by the police not to leave from there and begin walking home. In Hyderabad, according to a report by the India Today, 150 workers began walking to Andhra Pradesh, to Sri Kalakulam, which is 800 kilometers away, saying that they would rather go home than starve where they were. In Surat, workers of the textile industry, who just days ago had turned violent and set vehicles on fire, actually came out onto the streets again yesterday. These are visuals that you're looking at on your screen, demanding that they be allowed to go home. They said that they don't have food and they don't have work, and their textile industry owners have stopped paying them entirely. And Ahmedabad, there were groups of people who wanted to walk home as well. This is again according to a report by India Today. Now, here are the questions that we have to ask. Why is this happening? And is there anything for the government that the government can do to prevent these protests? Because it's obvious, if more and more people came out into the street to protest, we would defeat our purpose of the lockdown entirely. What should be done? What can be done to solve this problem? Yogendra Yadav and Mohan Guruswamy join me right now, two gentlemen who I have extremely high regard for, and they're very knowledgeable about what's going on. Mr. Yadav, if I may start with you. We've seen this sort of play out now through the entire lockdown. We're looking at another 20 days of lockdown. While the government has brought about some change in regulation 20th April onwards, what's happening on the ground? What have you picked up from the work that you are doing? Why are people so desperate?
Faye, your question actually contains the answer. Just imagine if you and your friend are stuck in New York. You don't have, you can't do your job. You have no source of earning. You cannot go out. Everything is locked and there is a danger of disease. What would you want to do? Somehow catch a flight back home at any cost. That's exactly what these people are doing. So there's really nothing to be surprised about. This is one thing that could have been anticipated. This is the most easily anticipable consequence, which unfortunately did not enter the mind of the policymakers. So let's not be surprised. Number two, let us not think that the visuals that we see are the only protests that are happening or the only problem that's happening. What we witness on our television screen, what we saw here, is only tip of the huge iceberg of discontent, of the large precariat that you have in India. What has been noticed in the last 2 or 3 weeks are the migrants who have managed to pack their stuff, who have come on the street. Now that's a minuscule of the migrant which would like to do so, but has no opportunity. There are large number of, the first category already includes about 6 lakh people, if we go by the Supreme Court affidavit of the Union of India. Then there are workers who are stranded in their place of work. This could be a construction site, this could be an open factory, this could be all kinds of places, who are stuck there, but no television camera can go to them, so they are there. Then there are people who are in rented accommodation, supposedly their home, but not really their desh, as they would call it, not really their home, who have to pay rent, who have to manage everything, and who have no source of livelihood left to them. And beyond this are people both in urban and rural India who are very much staying at their proper home, but who have no source for livelihood left to them. Now, all these are problems. The problem that we happen to notice is a very small subset of the real problem. And to my mind, this lockdown, especially the kind of extension that was announced yesterday, this is clearly now a cure which is proving to be worse than the disease itself. This has created such a huge livelihood crisis, which is not merely limited to livelihoods, as I might get an opportunity to speak later. This is life itself, the number of deaths that would be caused not directly, but indirectly by this lockdown could well be more than the deaths caused by coronavirus. So what all the workers are saying, गांव में मरे तो अच्छा है, भूख से मरना की स्थिति आ गई है. This is what we should take seriously, and really, to my mind, something urgent, something immediate needs to be done to address this.
There is an argument right now that, hey, listen, you know what? This is an emergency. The government is trying its best to control this COVID spread. Everybody needs to do their part. This is not the time, to sort of nitpick on this whole thing. Let's just make do with what we have. What is the response to that argument?
I really would like those who say, let's not nitpick, for them to be subjected to what these workers are going through. Remember, we are not saying the allowances should be raised a bit. We are not saying little DA should be increased a bit. What we are talking is absolute basics of minimum dignified living. This is what they are being denied. There is a national emergency, yes. It's a health emergency, yes. It requires distancing, yes. But I do not think it would have made a huge difference to the country if the lockdown began 2 days later, 3 days later. Everywhere in the world, some notice was given. Ours is the only country where nationwide complete lockdown has been imposed at 4 hours notice. I realized that
if you had given people 2 days, they would have crowded the trains. We would have run the risk of creating hotspots.
But Faye, that's exactly what is happening in these chawls, in these bastis. Go to Dharavi. What kind of social distancing are we talking about? It's a joke. The people who gathered together yesterday in Bandra, if there was a special train to take them back home, I bet it would have caused much less social crowding. Once they go back home, they have much better places to live in. Possibility of their being able to observe some social distance is infinitely higher in their villages than it is in places where they are staying. So strictly from point of view of health, running special point-to-point trains, to my mind, would have been and still is a much better idea. Take people, at least those who are out.
Yes, I will come back to the idea of allowing people to go back home, because there is the risk of them taking the virus from a city like Mumbai, which is worst affected, into the villages where we don't have the kind of hospitals or we don't have the kind of infrastructure that we have in the cities. But I'm going to come back to that point. I want to bring in Mr. Guruswamy now. For those of our viewers who don't know, Mr. Guruswamy used to be the advisor, the economic advisor to the finance minister when Mr. Yashwant Sinha was finance minister in the Vajpayee government. So Mr. Guruswamy, my question to you is this. You've been in government, you've been in rooms where these decisions are being made, where plans are being drawn out. Again, one of the things that keeps coming out is, how could the government possibly know all of these things? How can the government possibly cover for all of these possibilities of what happens to daily wage laborers, what happens to farmers, what happens to fishermen? Tell us how this works. Do you think it would have been possible for the government to have thought this through, thought out the implications of what's happening now?
When you have collective decision making, number of people sitting together to make a decision, then you have inputs coming from different directions, from health, agriculture, industry, etc., etc. And then a decision is taken collectively. That is the collegial model. When there's knowledge bases come in from all directions and it's pulled together, and you take a considered decision. What is the best option? We don't have that system in India anymore. We have a one-man decision-making squad. It's like, 4 hours to shut down. When Vajpayee took the decision to build the Golden Quadrilateral, the big road project, which was his big project this time, he called groups of us to sit with him for a few days and kept asking for opinions. And the quadrilateral was realigned for different directions and for what kind of a quadrilateral we should have, what kind of roads will we have, what about people who are traditionally used to using that road free from crossing from one side of the street to the other side of the street, from one village to another village. All this was discussed. And then he said, okay, now you work it out, I want to announce it tomorrow. Then a group of secretaries sat and they worked it out. And then gave it to him, he announced it. And he announced it in very big, bold terms. And he said, you know, this is there, but the details are all being worked out, but we're going to have this. Now, if you don't have that kind of system, our system is intended to be run in a collegial style. Internal migration is huge in India. 450 million internal migrants in this country, not unorganized labor, internal migrants, out of which 110 million are interstate migrants. That is, you know, like Yogendra said, people without homes, people without properties, people who are going and working in camps in 8, 10 to a room in tenements, you know, chawls or whatever you call it, in distant parts of the country. And suddenly you cut them off from livelihood. People who live on construction sites. There are 54 million direct employees in the construction sector, 52 million in the small retail sector. Most of these people are people without homes.
You know, I do want to ask you both this. Here's the question of the money, of where the money is going to come from. And there was, you know, a sort of need that the government, or a demand that the government announce relief measures for farmers, for migrant or daily wage laborers, and for really small businesses, workshops or textile or things like that that employ a large number of people. But the question is, where is that money going to come from? Mr. Yadav, if I come to you first, do you believe that with the extension of the lockdown, a relief package should have also been announced?
Indeed, and I was very disappointed. In fact, Faye, I must confess, I was one of the supporters of lockdown when Mr. Modi initially imposed it. I wrote to defend his position and said, look, under the situation, he seems to have taken, you know, one of the sensible decisions. Let's support him. But only to discover that things that could have been anticipated were not anticipated. Sure, you cannot anticipate the fact that doctors may be attacked, so you have to find some way to sort that later on. But surely, as Mr. Guruswamy has pointed out, you could have anticipated that this country has large internal migrants. You could have anticipated the fact that this country has agriculture, that it was a harvesting season. For these things not to be anticipated remains one of the real disappointing things. On the relief package, we all keep speaking about 1.7 lakh crore rupees. And this is unfortunately how these lies spread. As everyone knows, that 1.7 lakh crore package was actually, a lot of it was budget announcements that were dressed up once again. So we are really looking at a package which was more like 80,000 crore rupees or so. What does it mean in terms of GDP? I don't make comparison with US and other countries. These are rich countries, so we should not make a dollar comparison with that. But in terms of proportion of GDP, we have spent about 0.5% of our GDP on relief measures. Other countries have spent anything between 5 to 10%. Japan has spent 20% of the GDP. I'm not doing a monetary comparison. Why have we not done so? Faye, whenever you get an opportunity to speak to these people from the government, do ask them what prevents them from doing this. Number one, food. Universal ration to be given, which is to say anyone who presents himself or herself for the next 3 months, possibly 6 months, to be given food as per the normal ration norms, even if the person does not have a ration card. Mind you, our granaries are overflowing. FCI doesn't know how to store the food grain which is lying with it. And then to allow poor people to be in starvation-like conditions, it's shocking. Number two, the government can specifically run community kitchens, which is to say every school which cooks midday meal, and which is to say every government school of this country, every school can be invited, asked to carry out, to serve one meal a day, 2 meals a day. Both these things would require simply an order on the NFHA and NFSA by the government of India. Why does the government not do so? Number three, uh, on the uh, on the Manrega work, which has not taken place for the last 21 days, will not take place for another 7 days. The latest guidelines do say that Manrega work may be permitted. But for this 1 month period when it was not permitted, should the government not use the existing Manrega guidelines and pay them some compensatory wages, which it can pay? Number four, for these migrants who are stranded, these are like prisoners. We have forced them to stop working. We have forced them not to leave their home. And therefore, the minimum that we owe to them is not merely food, but also monetary support. A certain cash support has to be granted. To my mind, special trains ought to be run. But if for whatever reason the government says special trains cannot be run, then monetary support and food support has to be given. Where will the money come from? Yes, these are extraordinary times. Extraordinary money should be raised.
Let me bring in Mr. Mohan Goswami on the question of where the money will come from. Mr. Goswami, I know you've written an article to this point specifically. The question of spending any more than the 1% or less than 1% that we have, already pledged in this country. Where will the 8 lakh crore or the 10 lakh crore rupees come from? Do we have that kind of money?
Of course we have that money. Who says we don't have money? We have $490 billion sitting in American banks getting 0% interest or maximum 0.05% interest. You can run down $50-60 billion back and monetize it in India and use that money. You got 9 lakh crores with the RBI as reserves. You can take away 3 lakh crores. You have 11% of our GDP spent on government employees and their wages and pensions. You can get 1 lakh crores from that by just docking LTC, by rolling back 2 DA increments given, and by not giving leave. There are ways of getting this money. And why is the load of this act falling only on poor people? There are rich people there. There are people with money in banks. All fixed deposit. You have the FRDI Act already in place. Now, all people with over 1 lakh rupees in bank deposits, you can say, okay, we'll sequester 5% of that and give you bonds, interest-paying bonds, tax-free bonds. You can raise money there. You can raise money from the corporates. The big 10 companies in India, the big 10 alone have 11 lakh crores as cash reserves in banks. And why is the RBI lending them money now? Why is the RBI subscribing to their bonds? RBI money should be going to poor people. And there are channels of putting money. You kept claiming that 72% of the population has Jan Dhan accounts. Put money in those accounts. We're not saying giving it in the hands. If that is a logistical problem, bank accounts are there, put the money in the banks. And against production of a voter card, you can give rations like Yogendra said. You can open up, dozens of ration shops in different localities and say, here, take your voter card and collect your ration. You don't have to be in Patna to collect your Patna ration. You can have a Patna voter card and collect your ration in Baikala. You can do all these things. But the thing is, you've got to think them through. Why, what he announced, what the government announced today, that, road transportation is restored, that is, goods carrying and long distance trains carrying goods, etc. You could have done that on day one.
I just want to point out, so looking at the concessions that have been released by the Ministry of Home Affairs, they're active only 20th April onwards, and they're very specific. But Mr. Yadav, if I may ask you this, agriculture, all agricultural activities will be allowed 20th April onwards, including farming, MSP operations, mandis, fisheries, plantation, animal husbandry, and Manrega. Is this enough, is this enough to sort of ease the pain in the farming sector, or is it going to come too late? Has the government done enough?
Faye, I read the list. The list now, thankfully, mercifully, is quite comprehensive list. The only difficulty is, why does agriculture come as an afterthought? As Mr. Guruswamy keeps saying, this would have been the first thing anyone would anticipate on 24th of March. This is a harvesting season. To say that activities can begin after 20th of April. You know, my only fear is in Haryana, for example, procurement was to begin today. And I honestly don't know whether it has begun or now we've said it will begin only after 20th of April, which is another disaster. What is needed now is not only movement. What we absolutely must say, and I was hoping the Prime Minister would say so, is that every single grain shall be purchased at minimum support price. Ek ek dana kharida jayega. Modi ji is very fond of good communication. This is what I wanted to hear from him. Ek ek dana kisan ka kharida jayega. This is not happening. Distress sale is taking place. Procurement is likely to happen in Punjab and Haryana. I do not know how much of that will take place outside Delhi, outside these two big states and some centers. And sadly, as we would discover, most of the farmers will either end up selling cheap or hoarding, or if it is perishable commodity like vegetables, like fruits, like milk, so much has been wasted. Can the government say in the relief measures that it is about to announce or should announce, I think second installment of relief measures is much overdue. Can the government say that in case where farmers have failed to realize minimum support price, government will compensate them by deficit payment mechanism? And in cases where farmers have had to destroy their crop or were simply unable to access mandi to sell what they wanted to sell, would the government say under the Disaster Management Act or under the even previous disaster relief fund, they shall be paid compensation? Unless that happens, simply easing movement is not enough. This is what we need in the farming sector today.
All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for giving me your time today to talk about what could have been done and what can still be done in order to mitigate the problems of those working in daily wage or those in our farming sector. Mr. Guruswamy and Mr. Yadav.